All right, so we'll start chapter 22 here with just a basic overview of the immune system. It's not technically one of your body's organ systems, it's really the functionality of how your lymphatic system works. This is the first diagram from chapter 22, just to kind of remind you some things that we've seen in various chapters along the journey in A&P. We've got our leukocytes that are in our blood, so those are white blood cells, of course. We've seen in the last chapter lymphatic tissue with lots of different types of white blood cells residing in that tissue. We have not seen this yet, but we'll see it coming up in the respiratory chapter. So some of your organs around your body will have macrophages, for example, some white blood cells and other various types of white blood cells in different organs around your body. And your skin and mucous membranes, we saw dendritic cells or epidermal macrophages as an example of some white blood cells that live in your skin. And then in some connective tissues, we learned this in the tissue chapter of BIO211, that you have some cells called mast cells that are cells, immune cells that are found in several of the connective tissues all over your body, and we'll talk more about what they do in this chapter. The function of your immune system, or this immune component of your lymphatic system, is primarily, as you know, to protect against infectious agents, pathogens that cause disease. Patho means disease, so anytime you see that prefix, it has something to do with disease, and you actually learned about pathologic anatomy and pathologic physiology way back in chapter 1. Let's look at some things that are pathogens. So different categories here. First category is bacteria. There's lots of different types and species and strains of bacteria. If you take microbiology, you'll learn a lot more about all these different various pathogens. But bacteria, if you remember from maybe a BIO211 class, bacteria are prokaryotic cells. So they are cells. They're prokaryotes instead of eukaryotes. And they're very, very small microbes. And there's lots of different species, like I was saying. You see some examples here of some different microbe or bacterial species that cause different diseases. Not all bacteria are pathogenic or disease-causing. Some bacteria are good bacteria and contribute to your microbiome or your flora of microbes that live in your body and on your body. And that's to do good things, to outcompete the bad guys is one of their main goals. But bacteria that you should recognize would be the streptococcus or strep. That's what causes strep throat. And then Lyme disease is another fairly common disease caused by a bacterial infection. That disease is transmitted through tick bites, but the tick ingests a bacterium into your body, and then you have the Lyme disease. Really hard to get rid of, no fun at all. More pathogens. So a second group is viruses, and we see this in the news right now. Lots of it, right? Lots of viruses here. So the common cold is a virus, flu is a virus, mumps and measles, hepatitis, HIV, Ebola, chickenpox. Tons of viruses, including our ever popular coronavirus right now. A virus is not a cell, and this is part of what makes viruses really interesting from a scientific standpoint. They're not cells, but they can infect our cells and give us these horrible diseases. In terms of size, they're smaller than bacteria. So bacteria are tiny, but viruses are even tinier. And basically, a virus, if you've looked at the coronavirus pictures, it has a shell around it made of proteins, and it's got actually some little kind of spiky looking things on the surface. They're saying that they think that's how this coronavirus actually attaches to the tissue in your respiratory system, by kind of latching on with these hooks. But that's protein on the outside. And then on the inside, it's either going to be RNA or DNA. And I can't remember which one the coronavirus is. I think it's a DNA virus, but I'm not positive. Anyway, it's just a nucleic acid with some proteins wrapped around it. But as we know, that is enough to do a lot of damage, including killing the host in certain situations. So viruses, since they're not cells, they have to enter host cells or infected cells in order to reproduce. They do a type of cell division that's really unique to viruses, but they kind of take over the host cell's machinery and use all the host cell's parts in order to make more viruses. If you take microbiology or BIO211, you learn a lot more about this. So again, our examples are the cold, the flu, HIV, and of course, coronavirus. The third group of pathogens that you should know are the fungi. So fungi are cells, and you'll see the rest of these are eukaryotic cells. So cells more related to us than they are to the bacterial cells. Fungi are going to be, pathogens where we can get things like ringworm, yeast infections, athlete's foot. And then protozoans are found a lot of times in bodies of water, but they're also some of those pathogens or diseases that are transmitted by vectors or intermediate hosts. So malaria, I believe we talked about that a little bit when we learned about blood types. Giardia, if you've ever heard of that. Trichomonas, you can get from eating raw pork. African sleeping sickness. Toxo is another somewhat common one that you can get. There's a fear of that. If you're pregnant, you shouldn't clean cat litter boxes because of that one. So those are some protozoans. And then multicellular parasites. So this would be things like parasitic worms, tapeworms, blood flukes, hookworms, whipworms, penworms, all those types of worm infections. So those are more than one cell big and, microscopic, but they can actually grow to macroscopic once they're adults. All right, so those are some different classes or categories of pathogens. Moving on, we'll talk a little bit about the immune cells. So immune cells include all types of leukocytes. There are lots and lots of various types of leukocytes. We introduced them in the blood chapter, talked a little bit about more in the last chapter, and we'll learn even more in this chapter coming up. You've got your granulocytes that circulate in the blood, and you should remember which ones of those are the granulocytes. Go back to your blood chapter if you don't remember. And monocytes are cells, white blood cells, that are going to enter tissues, not just circulate in the blood. Those cells can differentiate and become macrophages. Macrophages, we've talked about a little bit before. They're large white blood cells that do phagocytosis. And that's what we're seeing here with that alveolar macrophage in the lung. And here with the dendritic cell, that's an epidermal macrophage found in the epidermis of your skin. You also have lymphocytes, and lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell that's going to be living in lymphatic tissues, and we saw some of those in the last chapter with your T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, and there's some different types of those, and we'll get into that more in this chapter a little bit later. You also have some chemicals that are going to come up in this chapter. So cytokines are a group of chemical. And there's lots of different types: interleukin, tumor necrosis factor, colony stimulating factors that you've heard of in the blood chapter, interferon. So we'll talk about some of these in the upcoming slides, but they are proteins, but they act like hormones. They're not technically hormones, but they act like hormones, and they're produced by some of the immune cells. So you can look here and get kind of a feel for it. T cells, macrophages, mast cells, virus-infected cells, or the NK, natural killer cells. That's where these cytokines are going to come from. And you'll see some of these abbreviations, IL, TNF, CSF, and IFN, as we move through some of the upcoming sections. Some of these are going to be involved with regulating other cells and the activity of other cells, and others are going to be really destructive, like you see here. Regulates immune cells for the interleukins, but destroys tumor cells for the TNFs. Stimulates bone marrow to produce leukocytes, and antiviral, interferons, and pro-inflammatory, so that's helping to regulate cells and being destructive. So interleukin and interferon are the two that we're going to focus on. Then looking at how the immune system and the immune response is kind of organized. This is an awesome diagram. I highly recommend that you take a few minutes to pause the video and write this out. Summarize these things, abbreviate, put things in your own word, but make yourself a chart like this. Make it big and keep referring back to it, because it'll help to kind of keep you grounded and organized as we get into all the different parts of this elaborate chapter. The two main divisions here are the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And how this is broken up is your innate immunity is a lot of different aspects. You can see here skin and mucous membranes, non-specific things like cells, chemicals, and inflammation and fever or physiological responses. This is how your body's going to respond immediately to all sorts of threats. Doesn't matter what kind of bacteria or what kind of virus it is. It's going to attack it the same way it would any other bacteria, virus, fungus, protozoan, whatever. So these are non-specific, meaning it's not targeting a specific coronavirus, for example. It could attack a flu virus, a coronavirus, or a streptococcus bacteria, or whatever, the same way. So that's what non-specific means. And it doesn't use any immunological memory, which we'll talk about more when we get over to this side. And this is a very rapid response. So fast, not specific, very generalized attack to any sort of pathogen over here on the left with innate immunity. And then the adaptive immunity on the right is specific. Because it's specific, now we're going to have a bigger response each time we get exposed to that same thing. Like if you've had strep throat in the past, you're going to build up some immunological memory to it. These are called antibodies in plasma and memory cells. So we'll get into that towards the end of the chapter. But the next time you get this streptococcus bacterial infection, you fight it off faster, as long as it hasn't evolved to a different strain. But because it's specifically targeting a certain species or a certain type of virus, it's going to be slower to act, because it takes your body a little bit of time to build up this specific immunity and respond to that specific target pathogen. So this is slower, but oftentimes better. Just depends on what's able to get past all of this by the time this kicks in. Do you need it or not? All right, so that's just the overview, and we'll pick it back up on the second video.